Hi folks, welcome to the first part of the Skeletal System lecture. What you're looking at on the left here is the reliquary of a Buddhist monk from about 1,000 years ago, and on the right, the surprise that researchers got when they did a CT scan of that same reliquary. As you can see there are the bones of a person inside. In fact, supposedly, at least they think it was a Buddhist master. In any case, what you can see clearly from this image is that the skull protects the brain, the vertebra in the back protect the spinal cord, and that the rib cage, also called the thoracic cage, protects the heart and lungs. And that's one of the most important functions of the skeleton. So, speaking of functions of the skeletal system, skeletal system supports the body and it protects vital soft body parts, as we saw in the previous image. You may not know that red bone marrow in the ends of our long bones when we're young and in certain other bones when we're adults contains all of the stem cells for the formed elements of blood. So that includes red blood cells, white blood cells, and the platelets that are required for blood clotting. Another really important function that folks don't usually think about is that the bones form a really important storehouse for minerals, specifically calcium and phosphorus, as well as for fat. So the calcium and phosphate are stored in the hard parts of the bone, whereas fat is stored in what's referred to as yellow marrow. That marrow is yellow because of the adipocytes that are found there. And then finally, the skeletal system allows for flexible body movements because the ligaments that connect bone to bone, as well as tendons that connect muscle to bone and that stretch across bones, allow for movement. So when we talked about higher order structures, right, moving from cells to tissues to organs. Each bone is considered an organ in and of itself. And remember that organs are made of multiple tissue types. So if you think about the kind of tissue that would be found in bone, obviously the first thing that probably comes to mind is connective tissue, right? Because ligaments are dense, regular connective tissue. Bones are made of bony tissue or osseous tissue. But you also have nervous tissue, right? Because each bone is innervated, which is why it hurts when you break a bone. Each bone also has epithelial tissue, right? And epithelial tissue is responsible for covering surfaces, lining body cavities, and forming protective barriers. So there's epithelial tissue associated with bone because there are arteries and veins associated with bone. And then finally, we can also describe the skeletal system as including muscular tissue. And that's because arteries have smooth muscle associated with them, but also because there's skeletal muscle that is attached to most bones. Okay, so when we describe the skeletal system, we're essentially going to focus on the three types of connective tissue that form the bulk of the skeletal system. Right? We're not going to focus a lot on the sensory endings in bone or the arteries and veins or muscles. We'll get to those in other parts of the course. So we're going to discuss types of bone, types of cartilage, which remember is another form of solid supportive connective tissue, and then the kinds of fibrous connective tissue associated with the system. All right, so cartilage first. Remember from the chapter on higher order structures, cartilage is a gel-like material. All connective tissue has an extracellular matrix. Remember, that's made of ground substance that contains fibrous proteins with widely separated specialized cells. And the kinds of cells we have in cartilage are called chondrocytes because the prefix chondro means cartilage. Cartilage doesn't have nerves or blood vessels. Now, the fact that it has no nerves makes it a really good padding to have between bones, because bones do have nerve endings. And anybody who has arthritis can tell you that when bone rubs against bone, it's quite painful. The fact that cartilage is avascular, remember, vascular means containing blood vessels. When you add the A, it means not containing blood vessels. So the function of those blood vessels is to carry away waste and also to carry in oxygen, glucose, and other nutrients to cells. Well, chondrocytes only have access to those functions by diffusion, which means that if cartilage heals at all, it heals very slowly. And there are three major types of cartilage. So fibrocartilage, right? We talked about this again in the higher order structures chapter. Fibrocartilage is the strongest. It has the most protein fibers and the least ground substance and the fewest cells of any of these. It's the strongest kind and the most sort of solid and least flexible of the types of cartilage. And we find it in certain parts of our knee joint and also in the discs, the intervertebral discs between the vertebrae and the spinal cord column, and as part of the pubic symphysis, which holds the two sides of the pelvis together. Next, we have elastic cartilage. You might not be surprised to know, given its name, that's the most flexible kind of cartilage. We see this kind of cartilage in our external ear flaps, also known as pinnae, as well as in a structure that prevents food from going down our tracheas, also known as our windpipe, called the epiglottis. And we'll talk more about that structure when we talk about respiratory and digestion systems. So, as I said in the higher order structures lecture, in this course, right, we are specifically interested in hyaline cartilage, which is found at the ends of long bones, in the trachea or windpipe, and in our nose. It's firm, but it's flexible, and when it's not stained, it looks essentially like a very smooth white glass. This is the sort of cartilage that allows our bones to glide smoothly across each other. So when we talk later about synovial joints, and this is the image on the right here is an example of a synovial joint. This word articular means related to a joint. A joint is an articulation. So articular cartilage is hyaline cartilage. The other reason for being interested in hyaline cartilage is that it forms the template for our bony skeletons during fetal development. All right, so dense fibrous connective tissue. Dense fibrous connective tissue, remember, very few cells, very regular, sort of cable-like organization. And Dense fibrous connective tissue is involved in this system in the form of ligaments, which connect bone to bone, so one bone to another, and tendons, which connect muscles to bones. And you want to be sure to keep those two straight in your head. Tendons connect muscle to bone, and ligaments connect bone to bone. One of the other things about bone that we don't often think of is that bone is actually living tissue, right? And that's right. There are cells that are carrying out very active metabolism. Maybe we don't often think of it as living tissue because it is it's so rigid. Bone's the strongest kind of connective tissue because the collagen fibers that the living cells produce and push out, exocytose, become mineralized with calcium phosphate and other sorts of mineral salts. Bone, as you guys have learned, is made of two basic anatomical types: compact bone, which is also referred to as cortical bone. Remember, the word cortex means bark and is often used to describe the external part of a structure. And then spongy bone. Spongy bone is also referred to as cancellous or trabecular bone. Compact bone or cortical bone is specialized for strength, whereas an ability to carry force that's pushed in one direction, whereas spongy bone is specialized in compression, the structure specialized for compression in response to stresses that come from a lot of different directions. All right. So in this course, we're really going to focus on long bones, right? In Anat Phys 1, you'll find, and actually in your textbook, I included a section about the different shapes of bone, but we really are going to focus on long bones. So that's the anatomy that you definitely need to have in your head for this course. All right, so here we go. The shaft of a long bone, the longest portion of the long bone, is referred to a diaphysis. Diameter. Dia means across. The diaphysis of a long bone in adults has a very thick outer collar of compact bone with a small amount of spongy bone. It's very difficult to see in this image, but a very small amount of spongy bone right in the inner surface. In adults, the inside of the diaphysis does not contain bone itself. That space is referred to as the medullary cavity. And remember, the other day I said we're talking about the nervous system. Medulla means middle, right? Whereas cortex refers to the outer surface. The inner surface of the medullary cavity is covered by a layer of epithelial cells that's referred to as the endosteum. Remember, endo is inner, and os or ost refers to bone. The space inside the medullary cavity is filled with yellow bone marrow, and that's a storehouse for lipids in adults. In addition, there are nerves and blood vessels that run through the medullary cavity, as you can see in the image. The bulbous ends of a long bone are referred to as epiphyses or an epiphysis. So that's the expanded end. So this is an epiphysis. Is this? These are primarily spongy bone, as you can see in the partial cutaway here. And so this is spongy. But there is a layer of cortical bone around the outside as well. Now, in a living animal, the area between the bridge-like structures, the bony bridge-like structures in spongy bone or trabecular bone, are filled with red bone marrow, and that is where we get the formed elements of blood, right? Remember, that includes red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. The proximal epiphysis, remember, proximal means closer to the trunk. So the proximal epiphysis of a bone is the one that's closer to the trunk. In this case, you guys would not be expected to know this at this point, but right, this is the bone we're looking at is a femur, and the proximal epiphysis of the femur fits into, or it makes up half of the ball and socket joint of the hip. The distal epiphysis is the end of a long bone that is farther away from the body, from the main part of the body, the torso. In both cases, the epiphyses, the joint surface of the epiphyses, are covered with, let me make that a different color, are covered with articular cartilage. And remember, articular cartilage is hyaline cartilage. All right, and then finally, in terms of long bone anatomy, right, we've got endosteum, which is a layer or more of epithelial cells that lines the medullary cavity. And the outside of the bone is covered by another membrane. It's called the periosteum, right? Peri, remember, means like perimeter. It means around. Os means bone. So this is a membrane that goes completely around the bone, and right, you can see in this image it's been cut away and pulled out. Well, this membrane has fibers that actually penetrate into, you can sort of see it here in this image, but these fibers penetrate into the cortical bone. And that's important because where tendons attach to bone, the fibers of the tendon are going to end up interlocking with the fibers of the periosteum, right? So the periosteum fibers are running this way, do that, and the fibers of the tendon are running this way. So essentially the two become woven together, and that helps prevent the tendon from ripping away from the bone. So you can see here there are areas where the blood vessels, nerves are going to exit, small holes in the surface of the bone where various kinds of vessels are going to exit. All right, so that's the end of part 1.